Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Tet. Today's daf is dedicated by Deborah Ashem Weiss in memory of her mother Edith Bedelheim Ashem, Pesel Bat Kalman, whose 30th year at is today. Mommy, you often said that Hitler robbed you of a Jewish education when you were forced to flee Vienna on the Kinder transport for London. Fortunately, you were reunited with your parents before the war in Bangor, Maine. You always encouraged me and was my closest unconditional buddy. I still miss you greatly. You laid the foundations for who I am today. You would be so proud of me and Robert and our children and grandchildren. With that, we'll be starting Masechet Sukkah Daf Tet. A quick announcement, Gefet will now be, it's one of the content that we have on our website, will now start appearing in English every week. It's a short shiur, about 20 minutes, that goes in depth into something in the Gemara, usually connected to a Gemara with Rashi and Tosfot. And it's teaching basic skills about how to learn through a Tosfot. The presentations are still in Hebrew. They do it along with a PowerPoint presentation, but the explanation and all of the whole shiur will be in English. So you can find that on our website. It also will get sent out with the links, with the links that get sent out on the WhatsApp groups. And it will be on tomorrow's daf relating to Sukkah decorations and aesthetics, etc. With that, we'll get started. Sukkah Yeshana, Beit Shammai Poslim, uBeit Hillel Machshtirim. So an old Sukkah, Beit Shammai says is no good. Beit Hillel says it's good. It's a kosher Sukkah. Well, what exactly does it mean an old Sukkah? So that the Mishnah asks, Ve'ezu hi Sukkah Yeshana. What makes something an old Sukkah? Kol she'asa'a kodem l'chag 30 yom. If it was built 30 days before the holiday. Okay, this means that if you built your Sukkah before 30 days before Sukkot, that's before the 30 days, that's already considered an old Sukkah. What's the issue of an old Sukkah? The point is you didn't make it for Sukkot. You built some sort of hut with some schach at the top. That's not for Sukkah. Beit Shammai says that is no good. Beit Hillel says, what's the difference? You need a Sukkah. This is a Sukkah. Aval, now it says, if you did it for the purposes of the holiday, then even from the beginning of the year, it would be okay. This seems to be according to Beit Shammai, although there are some somehow explain this according to Beit Hillel, but we'll go with saying this is according to Beit Shammai. And it means, even though Beit Shammai says an old sukkah is no good, that's only if the sukkah was built not for the purpose. And this relates to the last sukkah we just saw about the rakbash, if you remember, the ro'im, the kayatzim, the borganim, the shomrei perot, right? All those, or the sukkah nashim, the sukkah behemot, the goyim, all those different sukkot we saw in yesterday's daf. Right? Beit Shammai would say none of those are good. Beit Hillel says they're fine. Right? Beit Shammai says, but if you did them and you built them for the holiday of Sukkot, it's okay. Before we move on, I want to explain there's a lot of really interesting Tosfots in today's daf. The first Tosfot on the page, Sukkah Yeshana Beit Hillel Machshirim, he quotes the Yerushalmi and he says, Yerushalmi it says, Tzarich lechadesh badavar. Beit Hillel says, if you take a sukkah that was used all year round or it wasn't built specifically for Sukkot, you have to add something l'shem sukkah. Okay, then there's a debate whether it's kol shehu, just a little bit, or whether it's a tefach. And I say, even if you say a little bit, it might mean a little bit of schach that goes all across the sukkah. In other words, you have to put a little bit of schach on to show that this is going to be my sukkah for Sukkot. That appears in the Yerushalmi. It does not appear here in the Bavli. Okay, then he also points out that there's a debate about matzah yeshana. Can I use matzah that wasn't made, l'shem matzah, right, l'shem pesach? So he says there that there's a difference with matzah because it seems to say there is machloka Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, but then there's an opinion that says no, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel both agree that it's a problem when it comes to matzah. And what's the difference matzah and sukkah? Because if you didn't do matzah l'shem pesach, then it could be it has chametz in it. If you're making matzah for during the year, you're not so careful about the 18 minutes. You want a flat bread, but you don't necessarily care whether it has chametz in it or not. So that's why when it comes to Pesach, it has to be actually made l'shem Pesach. And maybe there's a difference there. It's an interesting thing to think about whether, right, there's a difference between sukkah and matzah in terms of that issue. Let's move on. Now the Gemara starts off and says, my time at the Beit Shammai, and we're going to go through, have a bit of a ping pong of the psukim. You can also follow this in the study guide for today. My time at the Beit Shammai. What's Beit Shammai's reason? Amalcha, the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkot Shivat Yamim LaHashem. Chag HaSukkot, 7 days to Hashem. Now, what's strange about that pasuk is what it means. Sukkot is a holiday for the people. What does it mean it's a holiday for God? So they say, Sukkah Suya L'Shem Chag B'inan. You need Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim LaHashem. It has to be l'shem shamayim. Sorry, for the sake of Sukkah. It's not like just take any booth. It's a Sukkah that was LaHashem, that was built specifically for this mitzvah of Sukkot. Ubeit Hillel, so what's Beit Hillel going to do with that pasuk? Because they don't think it has to be, and we're going to call this soon lishma, right? This is a halacha of, and it comes up in many different cases, that things have to be done for the sake of that particular mitzvah. So now we say, Beit Hillel, what are you going to do with that pasuk? You don't think that it needs to be l'shem sukkah. You could just take a regular sukkah and sit in it on the holiday, fulfill the mitzvah. He needs it for the following thing that Rav Sheshet said. Rav Sheshet said in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Now, by the way, Rav Sheshet came after Beit Hillel. So, because he's an Amora, Beit Hillel is from the Tanaim. So what it must mean is, Beit Hillel must have said the same thing that Rav Sheshet says later, and Rav Sheshet actually quotes it in the name of a Tana, Mishum Rabbi Akiva. Minayin latse sukash asurim kol shiva. How do you know that the tree, the leaves or whatever it might use that you're using, presumably for the schach? Okay, there's actually a debate here. Do we mean only the schach or even for the walls? Let's say you built walls made out of palm fronds. So, right, normally we don't do that, but let's say you did, or you made a wood sukkah. So, how do you know that what you use to build the sukkah is forbidden to benefit from all 7 days? Okay, this is what we call, and actually there's a whole debate in Tosfot what exactly we call this. So I'll get to that in a minute. But what it means is this is what we call isurei hana'ah, things that are forbidden to benefit from. You cannot benefit from the schach in your sukkah. And as I said, there's a debate among the commentaries whether this would also mean your walls of your sukkah as well, which, by the way, even if they weren't made of palm fronds, but they were made of cotton sheets, right, that we use, or whatever it might be that you use on your walls, canvas walls, you cannot benefit from them. So again, there's a debate whether they're also forbidden to benefit from. Okay, what does it mean to benefit from? So some commentaries say what it means is if you took the wood and you tried to use it for burning, you took them off and you tried to benefit from them, or maybe it even includes while they're on the sukkah, maybe you can't lean on the sukkah. Let's say you want to lean, let's say you have a ladder and you want to put the ladder, you don't want it to fall. So you lean it up against the walls of the sukkah. If you say that this is forbidden to benefit also from the walls, right? You wouldn't be able to do that. Or you want to put something on top of your sukkah. You have some books and you want to put them down, and for whatever reason you decide, I'm going to put those on top of the sukkah. That would be a problem to use the sukkah for that purpose, because that is benefiting from them, not for the purposes of the mitzvah of Sukkot. So where do we learn this from? He's going to derive it from that verse that Beit Shammai learned. The issue of an old sukkah, right? It has to be l'shem sukkah because it said Chag Sukkot LaHashem. That he learns that I'd say sukkah asuim kol shiva. How does he get it from the pasuk? Talmud Lomar, Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim LaHashem. The holiday of Sukkot should be 7 days to God. V'tanya. Now it doesn't yet explain it. There's a braita that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, some other Tana said, Kishem shachal shem shamayim ala chagiga, kachal shem shamayim ala sukkah. They take the word chag and they say chag, normally we translate as holiday. Chag also could be chagiga, which are the holiday offerings, the sacrifices that were brought. Again, we're going to connect back between Sukkot and the temple, right? Just like we did in the beginning of the Masechet, there were all these comparisons, the size of the sukkah to the size of the temple. Here we're now comparing to things that go on in the temple. The sukkah is like the sacrifices that were brought on the holiday. So now, how so? Just like Shem Shamayim Chalala Chagiga, just like the sacrifice of the Chagiga is offered to God and therefore can't be benefited from in any way. You can't just take it and say, oh, I'm going to use this for whatever reason. Kachal Shem Shamayim ala Sukkah. Likewise, the name of God is on the Sukkah. That's what it means, Chag Sukkot LaHashem. God's name is on your Sukkah. That means it belongs to God to a certain extent, which means you can't benefit from it in any way. Shene'emar, as it says in this verse, Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim LaHashem. Ma Chag LaHashem, Af Sukkah LaHashem. Just like the Chagiga is for God, also the Sukkah is for God. This, by the way, seems to be, again, if we talk about this comparison, we've been comparing the Sukkah all along to the temple. And what's the idea here? Shuli Mishkin had an article on Flashback this week all about the comparison of the Sukkah to the temple. If you haven't read it yet, recommended reading. And she talks there about the idea that the Sukkah is a place, the idea is that we're supposed to have a certain amount of worship of, just sitting in the Sukkah is like worship of God, like the temple, almost like a mikdash ma'at, like a small temple where, right, what's the idea of the temple? God's presence is there. Likewise, in our sukkah, the idea is that God's presence is among us in that sukkah. So therefore, we have this idea that since it's a dwelling for God, so to speak, therefore, one is not allowed to benefit from it. That's what Beit Hillel learns from the pasuk that Beit Shammai used about the Sukkah Yeshana. So now, right, again, what Beit Shammai darshans has nothing to do with our topic. It's just what Beit Hillel darshans has nothing to do with our topic. It's just that since Beit Shammai used that verse, we need to see what does Beit Hillel do with that verse, because Beit Hillel doesn't think that you need a sukkah to be lishma, right, built specifically as a sukkah. Which is interesting. If you think that this is a house for God, it's almost like we talk about cholent on Shabbat has a special nature, right? The cholent is different during the week than it is on Shabbat. Let's say you make a cholent on Wednesday night, it wouldn't have that special cholent taste to Shabbat. You know, people talk about that kind of thing. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying people talk about it. Likewise, here, it's the same idea. Beit Hillel says it could be the same sukkah, but when it's on the holiday and you're doing it, l'shem mitzvah, it has a different nature to it. But it doesn't need to be specifically built for Sukkot. Okay, he has no problem with a sukkah is a sukkah. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is, right? A cholent's a cholent. It doesn't matter what day. But when it's Shabbat, it's something different, right? When it's the sukkah, again, I'm using it as a silly comparison because we know you could make the same cholent. It might actually taste the same, but there's this belief of people that there's something about that cholent on Shabbat. So likewise, the sukkah, even though it might be built not l'shem shamayim, but when you use it for the mitzvah, it's something different. And then it can turn into this small kind of temple for God. Okay, next. Beit Shammai nami mibai le'lahachi. But wait a minute. If you want to say that you can't benefit from the sukkah, from the schach, let's say, or maybe even the walls, and that's why it says Chag Sukkot Shabbat Yamim LaHashem, Beit Shammai agrees with that halacha. So how can they learn two different things from that verse? So they say in Achinami, you're right. Beit Shammai does need to learn this, and therefore, Ela mai tamayu de Beit Shammai. So what's their reason? K'tiv kra'achrina. There's a different verse. Forget their original proof to Sukkah Yeshana. We don't learn it from there. We learn it from a different verse. Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim. It says Chag HaSukkot. Okay, this is a verse from Sefer Dvarim. It says Chag HaSukkot you should make for yourself 7 days. If you look in Rashi, Rashi says, how does he learn it from here? Sukkot ta'aseh lechag, sires hamikra v'darsheu. This is what we call a mikra mesuas, where one of the ways of extrapolating verses is to change the order of the words. He says, read it as ta'aseh lecha sukkot. Make for you sukkot instead of chag sukkot ta'aseh lecha. They kind of ignore the word chag and they say, oh, it's not just the holiday of Sukkot you should make for yourself, but it's the sukkah. And the sukkah ta'aseh lecha meaning l'shem, right? L'shem sukkah. So therefore they say, sukkah, suya, they use the word chag. Sukkot ta'aseh lechag. It's not the lechag, it's the lechag. Sukkot ta'aseh lechag instead of chag sukkot ta'aseh. Sukkot ta'aseh lechag. Make a sukkah for the holiday. The sukkah has to be built specifically for the holiday. So then, Beit Hillel, what does he do with that? He learned something else from that verse because he doesn't think that it has to be done l'shem chag sukkot. So what does he say? Oh, this teaches you Chag HaSukkot Ta'aseh Lecha means B'Chag HaSukkot Ta'aseh Lecha, meaning on Chag HaSukkot you can even build a sukkah. Meaning, if I, let's say, got to the holiday of Sukkot, and for whatever reason, maybe I was traveling and I got back late and my flight was delayed, and I didn't have a chance to build a sukkah before the holiday, and now, let's say I get home on Chol HaMoed, am I allowed to build a sukkah? So Beit Shammai says, yes, you can build a sukkah on the Chag, and you learn it from this pasuk. Chag HaSukkot Ta'aseh Lecha, meaning even on the Chag, I can build a sukkah for myself. Again, it's not the simple reading of that verse, but this is the world of drasha where you have poetic license, so to speak. Ubeit Shammai, so if they have something else they learn from this verse, what are they going to do with that? Beit Shammai sviralu keRabbi Eliezer da'amar ein osim sukkah b'cholosh hamoed. Beit Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that you're not allowed to build a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. You have to build it before. You can't build it on Chol HaMoed. Okay, so that's what we have. Before we move on, I want to go back to a Tosfot about this idea of when Beit Hillel said that all of the Atzei Sukkah Asurin Kol Shiva, you can't benefit. Okay, I'm going back to something we mentioned earlier because I forgot to talk about it before. Beit Hillel said, so again, what did we do right now? We took what's Beit Shammai's proof text for Sukkah Yeshana doesn't work, And what does Beit Hillel do with his pasuk? And we did it back and forth. First, we thought it was one verse of Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai. Then we said it was a different verse because he must hold with whatever Beit Hillel learned from that, which was that all of anything, right, your schach for sure, and maybe even your walls are forbidden to benefit from. So in the end, they learn it from a different verse, and Beit Hillel learned something else from that verse that you could build your sukkah on Chol HaMoed. Beit Shammai doesn't need to learn that, and with that, we're done. But if we go back to this idea of benefiting from the sukkah, why can't you benefit from the schach? Let's just assume we're talking about the schach. Why can't you benefit from it? So Tosfot says here, he says, it sounds from here like it's asur from the Torah because it's learned out from a verse. Generally, when we learn out something from a verse, so usually it means it's a Torah level. Not always. We have a smachta and all sorts of other things, but usually. But then he says, it sounds from another place like it's only Rabbanan, because in the Sukkah and Shabbat, if you remember, we learned this in Masechet Shabbat. It talks about what's called huktzah mitzvah. Something that is designated for a mitzvah is muktzah. Okay, we've learned about muktzah in Masechet Shabbat. If you didn't join us all, or you don't remember, I'll give you some background. Muktzah is something that's designated. Muktzah means really designated, set aside. And there's all kinds of set aside, like set aside because we won't use it on Shabbat because it's forbidden, let's say, like a TV, you wouldn't use on Shabbat, so the TV becomes muktzah, okay? But muktzah is also something that doesn't have a purpose, or it could be, it's designated for some other use. So something that's huktzah mitzvah is forbidden to use. So therefore, like Shabbat candles, you designated them besides that, you might blow them out. There's other issues, but since they're designated for a mitzvah, they're muktzah, machmat isur, basically, or machmat mitzvah. So now, that is in the category of muktzah, which would be exactly this. This was designated for the mitzvah of sukkah. That would be only rabbinic because muktzah is all rabbinic in nature. So here it sounds like it's d'oraita. There it sounds like it's muktzah. So Tosfot gives a possible answer, which Tosfot says that the issue is if it's still on the sukkah, then it's going to be muktzah d'Rabbanan. If you take it off, right? If it's still on your sukkah, your schach, it's forbidden on a Torah level to take that schach off and use it, let's say, to make a fire. That's midoraita. But if it's in its place, still in the sukkah, and you just want to put books on top, that maybe would only be rabbinic in nature. That's a distinction Tosfot tries to make. The other thing Tosfot brings up is a third sugya, which comes up also in Masechet Shabbat, which seems to indicate that noyei sukkah decorations, now here also it might even be the same as the schach, are because of bizoy mitzvah and not because of muktzah. And then you have to say maybe there's a distinction between decorations and the schach, but there seem to be three different things going on here, or three different categories. There's our sugya, which seems to say from the Torah, it sounds like these are forbidden like the korban chagiga, you can't benefit from them. Then there's this issue of muktzah, and then there's this issue of bizoy mitzvah, whether it's a disgrace to the mitzvah, you're disgracing it by using it for some other purpose, right? You stick your books on it, that's not, right? You wouldn't do, if you had something very special, you certainly wouldn't put books on them and lean your books on them or lean your ladder on something that had a special quality to it. You would take care of it. So if this is used for a mitzvah, it would be disgraceful. So these seem to be three different categories, how they all work in together and how it all fits. Tosfot has some explanations, others have others, but know that there's an issue here about exactly how we categorize this issue. Okay, next. Now we're going to ask a question on Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel said that a sukkah yeshana is fine. It doesn't have to be built l'shem sukkah. Now we're going to question this. Beit Hillel, does Beit Hillel not hold by what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav? Now again, Rav Yehuda came after Beit Hillel, but still, if they said it, it must be other people thought it before them. And how could Beit Hillel not hold by this? What is this statement that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav that's so critical that how can we say Beit Hillel disagrees? Let's see. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, asa'a min hakotzim, umin animim, umin hagradim, psula. We don't really understand these words yet. We don't even know what the topic is. I'll tell you all of that. The topic is tzitzit. Tzitzit is a four-cornered garment that you have to add these strings to it. What can you use for the strings? So it says here, you can't use, now I'll already tell you there's different interpretations what these things are. Kotzim, nimin, or gradim. I'm not going to get into all the details. Julie is my expert in weaving. I don't have her on the Zoom today because I'm pre-recording, unfortunately, but the commentaries describe, okay, Rashi, for example, says, kotzim are chitim shenitku bashti. Okay, they're strings that got caught in the loom, okay, or tied into there. As you hang the clothing on there after it's woven. And it's called kotsim because it sticks out like a thorn. That's one possible. There's different explanations what these exactly are, but they seem to be different strings that are left over from something. Okay, gradim, they say, is at the end of the talit, you have like strings coming out. Nimin, or is it, Rashi says a talit shetafluha, they sewed it. Osh asuva imra b'machat, v'rashechu te'atfiyat tuluyimba. Like again, from the sewing, you have a little bit of something sticking out there. Okay, so some is from the sewing, some is from the weaving. The main idea here that's important to understand is these are strings that were kind of left hanging from something. So if you make tzitzit from those, it's psula, that doesn't work. However, mina sisin would be ksherim. Okay, what are mina sisin? So Rashi says, kiot kaduriyot shel chut. Okay, these are the strings of thread. Okay, meaning you have like a ball of yarn, like a ball of thread. You could take it from there and use that for your tzitzit. Now, Ki amarita kamei de Shmuel, it continues and says, Rav Yehuda said, that's what Rav said. When I told Shmuel this, what did he say to me? Amarli af min asisin nami psula. By the way, if you remember, Rav was the Rosh Hashiva. After he died, Shmuel became the Rosh Hashiva. And Rav Yehuda first studied with Rav. After Rav died, he studied with Shmuel. And he constantly has these conversations where he says, oh, Rav taught me this, but when I went to Shmuel, he told me something different. So he says, Af min asisin nami psula. Even from the sisim, from this ball of thread, is also a problem to be inan tefiyah lishma because it needs to be spun for the sake of tzitzit. So either, according to Shmuel, it has to be spun, even the thread has to be spun for the sake of the mitzvah. Or if you hold like Rav, maybe it doesn't need to be spun for the sake of it, but it needs to be put on the clothing for the sake of it. You can't just take a string that was hanging off and use that for your tzitzit. To be inan tefiyah lishma, because you need specifically some sort of lishma, whether it's tefiyah lishma, the spun for the sake, or even just put on for the sake of the mitzvah. So if we're going to assume he holds like Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav or Shmuel, that you need some sort of lishma when it comes to tzitzit, hachanami, you buy sukkah lishma, so you would also need sukkah for the same sake of the mitzvah. So what's the difference between sukkah and tzitzit? That's really the issue here. To which the Gemara answers, we're going to have it simply from the text, okay? It's going to all come from what it says in the psukim, no kind of theoretical, from looking at what's the real difference between sukkah and tzitzit. They're going to use from the verses, but maybe there's something conceptually behind this about the difference between them. But now they say, Shane hatam damar ka gedilim ta'aseh lecha. It says by tzitzit, make yourself these gedilim, right, which is a word that they explain to mean the tzitzit. You have to make these tzitzit for yourself. What does it mean, lecha? L'shem chovcha. Lecha means make them for yourself for the purpose of the mitzvah. That's why. Not by Sukkot, though. Now they say, what are you talking about? Hachanami chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha. By chag Sukkot, it says make for yourself chag Sukkot, meaning make yourself Sukkot. L'shem, meaning build a sukkah for the sake of the mitzvah. Exact same thing as by tzitzit. How could you say the difference? Lecha l'shem chovcha. Lecha for your obligation. So they say, oh no. When it says lecha by sukkah, it comes to exclude a stolen sukkah. That's to tell you make for yourself, meaning don't take someone else's. Okay. So they say, wait a minute. Okay, why don't you say the same thing by tzitzit then? Why don't you say dilim ta'aseh lecha and don't steal someone else's tzitzit? So they say, okay, fine. So you're right. Lecha really means for yourself, don't steal it. But by tzitzit, there's a different verse that doesn't appear, a similar verse to that in Sukkah, which is K'tiv Kra'achrina, Vasu lahem mishelahem. It says Vasu lahem tzitzit. We say this every day in Shema. Vasu lahem tzitzit. And that means make for yourselves mishelachem, from your own. Meaning, right, it has to be your own. And therefore, that verse comes to teach you, not one that's stolen. And the lecha comes to teach you for the purpose of the mitzvah. Okay, so now I want to just go back before we get to the next Mishnah, which is this concept of a stolen sukkah. Now, one of the most famous sugyas in Sukkah, Masechet Sukkah, we're going to get to in the third chapter, is about lulav hagazul, a stolen lulav. And there it talks about the concept mitzvah haba ba'avera. You can't do a mitzvah using something stolen because that's basically a mitzvah and a transgression are opposites. And how could you possibly do a transgression in order to fulfill a mitzvah? And the question is, why here you would need a special verse to exclude something that's stolen if we have this concept of mitzvah ba'avera, which should seemingly apply across the board? So first of all, there's a really interesting discussion about mitzvah ba'avera. Does it apply across the board to all mitzvot, or maybe not necessarily? Maybe it's only things like lulav, and there's a whole theory built here about lulav. That the lulav, when you shake the lulav, it's a way of worshiping of God, and there the Sukkah compares, and we'll get into more in depth, compares it to sacrifices. Again, this comparison, we keep coming back, comparison to sacrifice. You have to remember also, the people were in the wake of the destruction, and they wanted things to fulfill the need of the absence of the temple. So they often compared things to temple service. So the lulav is a way of worshiping God. Question is a sukkah that or not? Now, we did describe earlier that it seems like it is. However, at first glance, it doesn't really look like you're doing worship. You're sitting, you're eating in the sukkah, you're sleeping in the sukkah. Those are basic everyday needs. It's not necessarily something you would do necessarily in a temple or as a worship of God. So possibly some people say mitzvah ba'avera is only things that are done, and they use the word, the Ritva uses this word, uses liritzui, for appeasing of God. So for bringing in offering. Now the sukkah is not any kind of offering, whereas the lulav, shaking the lulav and etrog and the four species is maybe this idea of some sort of worship and appeasing of God, right? It's people connected to bringing rain, and we want to appease God, so he brings the rain. Sukkah doesn't have that element. And therefore, mitzvah ba'avera maybe wouldn't apply in that kind of a mitzvah. It applies when you're talking about a mitzvah that's worship of God. But when we're not talking about worship of God, maybe there is no, this issue of mitzvah ba'avera isn't so blatantly problematic. And then to which the Gemara is saying, oh, but there's a special verse here, which is teaching you that it's problematic. Okay, so that's all discussion here. Let's see if there was anything else. Right, there's other ways of saying why. Oh, then there's a whole thing the Ritva brings up as well about what even is a sukkah gezula. What does it mean to steal someone's sukkah? Steal someone's sukkah. Well, you could be sitting in. You could take someone's where they have their sukkah and sit in it. Right now, is that stealing? First of all, you're basically stealing the property, and there is no such thing as gezel by property. If I just sit in your property, that's not called stealing it. So there's a whole halachic thing about that. Stealing land is not the same as stealing something else. So it's not even called stolen. If I took your wood and I built my sukkah with your wood, so according to rabbinic law, we're going to get to this, you actually don't have to return the sukkah. The sukkah, the sukkah itself becomes yours. It's just that you have to return the wood. And that's a whole other issue that we're going to get to later. So that's also not really stolen. So the Ritva suggests that maybe you're talking about if your sukkah was on a boat, which we're going to see that case in the Mishnah out. If your sukkah was on a boat or something transportable, and then you stole the boat with the sukkah on it, that could actually be a case where you actually stole somebody's sukkah. Otherwise, it would be hard to find even a case of sukkah gezula, which is another interesting discussion. Moving on, though, to the next Mishnah. How says sukkato tachat ha'ilan? If you build a sukkah under a tree. Okay, so you have a tree there, you build your sukkah under the tree. It's as if you built something in your house, okay? Because it already had a cover, that's not considered a schach, a kosher schach, because you have this pasul schach on top of it. There's a whole debate about whether this applies if you built your sukkah first and then the tree came out. I don't know exactly how you would have this case, but then kind of this tree became, let's say somebody planted a tree after your sukkah was built, whether it would be the same disqualification since you actually built your sukkah properly and then it came after. Again, a side issue we're not going to get into. This whole language of ki'ilu asa'ah b'toch habayit, as if you built it in your house, is a strange language. It should have just said psula. It's disqualified, no good. So we'll get to that in the Gemara. Second case in the Mishnah, sukkah gabe sukkah. If I build a sukkah on top of another sukkah, the upper one is okay. The bottom one is problematic. Rabbi Yehuda says, if nobody's living in the upper one, then the bottom one is okay. We'll have to talk about what exactly that means, and we'll get to that in the Gemara. First part of the Gemara now. We're going back to the sukkah under the tree. Amarav, lo shanu ela, he's going to narrow. Lo shanu ela means we didn't learn the Mishnah except for, meaning we're going to narrow the case of the Mishnah. Ela bi'ilan shetzelato meruba mechamato. Has to be a tree where its shade is greater than its sun, meaning it's very, the leaves are the branches and leaves are very close together, and mostly you're getting shade from this. But if it was more sun was coming through them than shade, then it would be okay, because that wouldn't be considered schach that's blocking off the other schach, right? That's basically not disqualified schach that blocks good schach. It would just be nothing really, because a lot of the sun comes through. So the Gemara asks, Mimai, where do we get this from? So we'll tell you. Specifically because of the way they worded it. It's as if you did it inside your house. Why did they use that wording? I could have just said it's disqualified. They're going to say the fact that they use those words is going to teach us something. That we need a tree that's like a house, meaning in order for it to be disqualified, has to be a tree that's like a house. And what makes a house a house? A house always, right? It blocks you from the sun. The shade is greater than the sun that comes through. Therefore, the tree here that disqualifies must be just like a house, which is so now they say, wait a minute. If the sun coming through was greater than the shade, so what would it be? Why wouldn't you just say that you have schach, right? You have disqualified schach on top and you have kosher schach at the bottom. This sukkah has kosher schach and non-kosher schach, and that should be a problem. So how can you say, you can't just ignore the tree at the top. It's something that's chamam, right? The more sun comes through than shade is disqualified. And this is disqualified because it's attached to the ground. So basically we should be saying, here you have disqualified schach, because it's right. The main problem with this is that it's attached to the ground. I didn't mention that, but that's the problem with the tree. Anything, the schach has to be something detached from the ground. If it's not detached from the ground, it's a problem. So basically we should be saying here that if you should still be calling that disqualified schach because it's attached to the ground. So we have disqualified schach on top, good schach at the bottom. Who cares if it's more sun than shade coming through the top? It's still disqualified schach because it's attached to the ground. So they say, so what's the case? It must be the reason why this is okay, if there's more sun than shade, is because it's not a simple case where we said above is the tree, below is the schach. No, it's b'shechavtan. What does chavtan mean? So Rashi explains that you bent the leaves, the branches downward, and the leaves, and you attach them to the schach, and they're intertwined. Now, why does this matter? Because in general, we've learned in many different sugyot this issue of what we call bitul, nullification. Nullification works in what we call a ta'arovet, a mixture, like your milk falls into your meat, your cholent. I'm talking about cholent a lot today. Your milk falls into your cholent. It's all combined, right? And then we say, if there's 60 against the meat, right, meat against the milk is disqualified, is nullified, better to say, nullified. Likewise here, if you mix the schach, and you have schach kasher and schach pasul mixed together, if the majority of it is schach kasher, which we know because the tzel is merubah from the shemesh, meaning this is mostly blocked, in come your vine, let's say it's a vine or a tree, here, let's call it a tree. In comes your tree, in a minute we'll get to a vine, same thing though as the tree. In comes your tree, mixes together, but the tree is much more sparse because it's chamatan merubah mitzelata. The sun coming through is greater than the shade. If these intertwine and the schach that's kosher is more than the schach that's not kosher, then it's going to nullify the non-kosher schach. So therefore, what Papa says, if you mix them, then it will be nullified. If in fact the tree is higher than the schach, it's not batel, it's not nullified, and it's actually problematic because you have a non-kosher schach, even if more sun is coming through than shade. But when we say that we can infer from this Mishnah, that it's only when it's more shade than sun, but if it were less shade and more sun, and it were, you have to add, and it were intertwined with the schach, then it would be totally fine because it's nullified. Okay, that's what we say. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you're going to assume that it's intertwined, it's pretty obvious. Regular laws of nullification. Why would you even need to tell us this? So they say, and again, they're assuming that's what the Mishnah is trying to teach us. under the lines, right? By saying, it has to be house-like. It's not house-like, more sun, it's okay. But that would only be if it's mixed in. And then as regular nullification laws, no reason to tell us this. So they say, well, maybe we'd say, even if it were intertwined, if we didn't have the Mishnah to teach us this, we think even if it were intertwined, it would be a problem because we don't want to allow intertwined. Maybe, even though it is allowed, because maybe you'll think that when they're not intertwined, it'll be okay. And that for sure isn't. So therefore, maybe they make a gzera, right? They'd say, well, this is forbidden so that you don't come to think other things are permitted. Kamash malan de lo gazlina. Therefore, the Mishnah taught you, we actually don't make a gzera here. It's not forbidden. So now they say, wait, if that's what the Mishnah is trying to teach us, that we don't make a gzera in the case where they're intertwined, just in case you might think if they're not intertwined, it's okay. But that Hanami Tanina, we also learned that in a separate Mishnah. And I told you we get to vines. Here we're going to talk about a vine. If you take a vine from the grapes and you sprawl it across the top of your sukkah, or from gourds, which also could theoretically grow a little bit more vine-like, such the note in the Koran explains. Kisus, which is another type of vine, Rashi explains, we don't know exactly what it is. And then you took your vine that's attached to the ground, which is disqualified, and you put on top psula, right? And you put on top of it kosher schach. Psula, it's disqualified. But here it says in the Mishnah, but if the schach was much greater than the amount of the vine that you put on, or you cut the vine, then it would be okay. Now, hechidami, what's the case? Is it chavtan or lo chavtan? If you're going to say b'shalo chavtan, hakam mitztar schach basulim schach kasher, it can't possibly be that they're not one on top, that they're not intertwined, because if they weren't intertwined, laws of nullification wouldn't work. So for sure it's not that, because then you really do have schach pasul, and there's no way it would be okay. So therefore, it must be elalav kishachavtan. It must be where they're intertwined, which actually it sounds like that also, because it says you put the geffen and then you put on top of that the schach. It sounds like they really are intertwined. Ushmamina de lo gazlinan, and it says it's okay as long as there's more kosher schach than non-kosher, and that already tells us what we just said we're going to learn from our Mishnah. So there's no point for our Mishnah to teach you that if the other Mishnah teaches you that. So they say, well, ma'u detema hanimili b'di'evet, aval lachatchila lo kamash malach. That Mishnah, hidlala together, and then you put the schach on top, that's where it's already done. So you happen to put your vine there, and then you put the other thing, and then you might think, okay, well, since I put now schach kasher, that's b'di'evet, it's already done, and maybe we'll say it's okay. But it doesn't mean you could decide to do that from the beginning, like build your sukkah underneath the tree. That we learn from our Mishnah. So our Mishnah is teaching you, even if you do it on purpose, as long as they're intertwined, it's okay, and we don't make a gzera, that maybe you'll confuse it when they're not intertwined. And that's what we learn from our Mishnah. Next case, sukkah al gabe sukkah, sukkah on top of a sukkah. Tanu Rabbanit, b'sukkot teshvu. What do we learn from b'sukkot teshvu? Sit in sukkot. V'lo b'sukkah shetachat sukkah, and not a sukkah that's under another sukkah. V'lo b'sukkah shetachat ha'ilan, and not a sukkah that's underneath a tree. V'lo b'sukkah shebetoch habayit, and not a sukkah that's in your house. We learn that all from b'sukkot teshvu. To which the Gemara says, Adrabah, what do you mean? Sukkah underneath a sukkah? Well, the more so you should think it's okay. Why? Because it says b'sukkot, plural sukkot. What kind of plural sukkahs? Sukkah on top of a sukkah. Tarte mashma, it sounds like two. Should be okay. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, you might remember this from a few days ago. B'sukkot k'tiv, it's written without the vav. And if we say yesh em la masoret, it goes by what it said, right? What it's written. It says it without, which means singular, which means it teaches you only one sukkah. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now I'm going to start with this line of Rabbi Yirmiyah that we'll continue to explain tomorrow. פעמים ששתיהן כשרות, פעמים ששתיהן פסולות, פעמים שתחתונה כשרה ועליונה פסולה, פעמים שתחתונה פסולה ועליונה כשרה. This is very common language in Mishnayot. It comes up in Pirkei Avot a lot, where they give 4 possibilities. You might remember from Pirkei Avot, it comes in a lot of Mishnayot as well. This time it's an Amora saying it. Rabbi Yirmiyah was an Amora from Israel. But 4 different possibilities, okay? Possibilities and permutations. You could have 2 sukkahs, one on top of the other, and they're both okay. You could have sukkahs that are one on top of the other and not okay. You could have a sukkah where the bottom one is okay and the upper one is not, or the bottom one is not okay and the upper one is. Okay, now we're going to go through all the cases. What's the case where both could be kosher? The top one, the schach, is very sparse. You have a lot more sun coming in than shade. The bottom one. So you have a sukkah on top of a sukkah. The schach in the middle is very sparse. The schach on top is very good schach. So the schach on top is good schach. Basically, we view the middle one as if that's not schach at all because it's just sparse schach. And therefore, they'll both be okay. You can sit in one or the other because you're basically functioning with the schach at the top of the upper one. The next case, 1 second. Oh, wait, I didn't finish reading. And obviously the upper one has to be within 20 amot. If it's higher than 20 amot, of course, it's not going to be good. So how could they both be disqualified? Both of them are good kosher schach. The top one, though, is above 20. So the top one's disqualified because it's above 20. And the bottom one's disqualified because the top schach is actually good and it disqualifies the bottom schach because you're not anymore in a sukkah because you're functioning with the schach from the sukkah above and you have schach now in the middle blocking it. So it really has no kosher schach. Okay? And that's no good. Pamim shetachtona kshera ve'elyona psula. 1 second. Right. So again, let me just clarify. The bottom sukkah there is a problem because it has a sukkah on top of it. The problem is that sukkah itself isn't kosher, and that's why neither of them are kosher. Now the next case. Okay, we'll just continue and go through these two cases. The bottom one is good, but the top one is no good. Okay, what could that be? The bottom one has good kosher schach, and Elyona, but the upper one is chamata meruba mitzelata. They're both within 20, but the upper one has too much sun coming through, so that's no good. But the bottom one is good because it has nothing on top of it because the top one is insignificant. Even though it's within 20, the schach is no good. And last one, what's the case? Both have more shade than sun. And the upper one is within 20. So then the upper one is good and the bottom one is no good because the bottom one is a sukkah within a sukkah and the top one is a kosher sukkah. So that one actually works. Okay, tomorrow we're going to ask, Pshita, isn't this all obvious? Why is Rabbi Yirmiyah telling you this, right? You could have actually come up with the logic for all those cases. So what is the chidush? We'll finish for today and pick up tomorrow's stuff.